The sharp metallic taste spread across her tongue. Not blood, but fear itself. Thickened until it had become a flavor. Renly Caldwell stood behind the dark walnut bar at Velvet Ember, her hands trembling so badly she could hardly recognize them, as she poured a stream of amber whiskey into a crystal glass, while the tiny USB in her apron pocket burned against her like a live coal, a drive no bigger than a bean that held the kind of evidence that could send her boss to prison for life, or send her to the bottom of the Mississippi River before the sun had a chance to rise. Soft live jazz drifted from the corner stage. Amber light spilled down from antique crystal chandeliers, and gentlemen in expensive suits laughed through curls of Cuban cigar smoke. The entire French Quarter on this Saturday night wore the most glamorous face New Orleans could offer, a beauty so lavish it felt cruel, because not a single person in that gilded room knew that the amber-eyed bartender behind the bar held in her hands proof that could bring down the underground empire of the entire city. For the past 10 years, Ren had carried on her narrow shoulders the mysterious death of her honest police officer father, the cancer that took her mother when she was 16, and now the full weight of her twin brother's $80,000 debt as he disappeared somewhere into the drug smoke of some forgotten corner of the city. She had worked 3 jobs at once, studied forensic accounting in night classes, and slept 4 hours each night in a leaking apartment in Treme, all for this one moment. For tonight, when she had finally uncovered the truth that the man laughing out there among the New Orleans elite, the man who had hired her when she was at her hungriest and poorest, that generous saint of charity foundations, was the very man who had ordered her father's murder 10 years earlier. But Ren had no idea that at exactly 13 minutes past 9 tonight, the heavy oak door of Velvet Ember would open, and the man who stepped inside wouldn't be an ordinary guest, but a man in a black suit with blue-gray eyes as cold as granite. A man whose name the whole city only dared whisper in the dark. A Mafia boss her enemy feared more than they feared God himself. And that in less than 5 minutes after he took the first sip of the cocktail she had mixed with her own hands, a burst of gunfire would rip through the air of the bar, the USB would slip from her apron pocket and skid across the wooden floor, and the most dangerous man in the southeastern United States would bend down, pick it up, and look straight into her amber eyes, with a gaze that held no judgment of her beauty, no hunger for her body, but instead as though he were reading every page of her soul, only to change forever everything she had ever believed about men, about justice, and about the true cost of freedom. If Renly and Ronan's story touched your heart, don't forget to press like to give the channel more encouragement. Please share this video with the people you love, because every one of us deserves to find a place where we can stop running. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any more moving stories to come. I'll see you again in the next video. At exactly 9:13 that night, when the hand of the old pendulum clock mounted on the mahogany-paneled wall landed with eerie precision on that fateful number, the heavy oak doors of Velvet Ember opened slowly, not loudly, not theatrically, yet enough to make the entire gilded room seem to stop breathing for one suspended instant, and even the long wailing saxophone of the jazz band seemed to soften, as though the very notes understood they ought to bow before the man who had just crossed the threshold. He entered without haste, dressed in a black bespoke suit fitted perfectly across his broad shoulders, the collar of his white shirt left open at the throat to reveal the hard line of his neck. And following close behind him were 2 men, with faces so uncannily identical, they seemed less like brothers than mirrors. Reed and Rhys Donovan, 2 silent shadows whose razor-sharp eyes swept the room in less than 3 seconds. Ren knew at once who he was, though she had never seen him in person. Because in New Orleans there were certain names people didn't need to see to recognize, names that only had to be whispered in darkness, for hearts to slow by a single beat. Sterling Pemberton, seated in the corner VIP section and laughing with a Louisiana state senator, faltered mid-smile, and the generous grin of the saint of charitable foundations cracked for a fraction of a second before being hastily pieced back together, the wineglass in his hand tipping just enough for one dark red drop of Bordeaux to spill over the rim like a tiny bead of blood. And Ren was the only one in the room who noticed that small detail, because in the full 3 years she had worked under, she had never once seen Sterling Pemberton lose composure enough to spill a single drop of wine. He moved forward to greet the newcomer with the false charm Ren knew too well. But Ronan Blackwood didn't even glance toward the prepared VIP room with its waiting bottle of 25-year-old Macallan. He merely gave a polite nod and walked straight to the bar, pulled out the tallest leather stool, and sat down directly in front of her. Close enough for Wren to see the early traces of silver at his temples, close enough to catch the quiet depth of a rare cologne she couldn't name, close enough to feel those granite, cold gray eyes resting on her without the faintest trace of hunger, only pure observation, like a watchmaker examining the mechanism of an antique clock. And old-fashioned, in the oldest way possible. No orange, not even lemon peel, he said, his voice deep and measured, each word falling like stones laid into an old city street. And Wren nodded, her hands suddenly stopping their trembling for the first time in the last 3 hours, because in that moment the USB drive in her apron pocket seemed to cool, as though some nameless man had just lifted an invisible shield between her and the entire golden room full of enemies. She chose the 10-year Boulet Bourbon instead of the younger, cheaper liquor most regulars ordered, dropped exactly 2 dashes of Angostura bitters onto a small sugar cube, and crushed it at the bottom of the glass with a wooden muddler. Then stirred, never shook, exactly 82 turns. The number an old bartender in Savannah had once told her was perfect for marrying the scent without watering the spirit down. When she slid the cocktail across the polished bar, Ronan Blackwood lifted it, took a small sip, closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them and looked straight at her, and on that face, usually as cold and fixed as carved stone, there appeared something that made even Reed and Reese behind him glance discreetly at one another in surprise. A faint smile, lasting no more than half a second, but enough for Wren to notice. "You're the first one in this city who's made it right," he said, his voice low as a murmur, and before she could offer any polite word of thanks, 3 things happened almost at once, all in the very instant she would remember for the rest of her life. The oak doors burst open violently. 3 strangers in long gray coats rushed in with the speed of hunters. Somewhere at the back of the room glass shattered, and before Wren could understand what was happening, she found herself dragging an elderly woman in a black lace dress down behind the bar, a reflex she didn't know she possessed, perhaps learned from all those childhood nights spent chasing after her father to accident scenes. The next 30 seconds passed like a blurred dream. She heard tables overturning, people screaming, Ronan Blackwood giving a single command in Italian she didn't understand. And when she finally dared lift her head over the walnut bar, the 3 strangers had already been forced to the floor, Reed and Reese standing on either side like 2 statues, while Ronan was still standing exactly where he had been, the old-fashioned in his hand not even rippling, as though all that chaos had been nothing more than a breeze passing over the surface of a deep lake. But in that very moment, just as Wren began to rise on unsteady legs, she felt the tiny USB drive, no larger than a bean, slip from the sweat-damp pocket of her apron, hit the wooden floor, roll once, and stop exactly a foot from the toe of Ronan Blackwood's polished leather shoe. Time stopped. Wren felt her heart drop straight through her chest. Ronan bent down, slowly lifted the USB between 2 long fingers, and paused there half-bent for a moment longer than normal. Long enough for Wren to know he understood. Long enough for her to realize that this man wasn't the kind who held an unfamiliar object without thinking. Yet when he straightened and placed the USB back in her palm, his fingers touching hers for the span of a single heartbeat, his eyes, those granite, cold blue-gray eyes, never once dropped to her body, never once skimmed any curve. They stayed fixed on her amber eyes as if reading a book he had been searching for a very long time. "You dropped this," he said calmly, as though nothing at all had happened, then reached into his breast pocket, withdrew a neatly folded $500 bill and a blank white business card with no name on it, only a single phone number printed in black ink, set them both down on the edge of the bar, looked at her one more time, and said in a voice so deep she felt it echo in her chest, "If you need to, call." Then he turned and walked away, the black suit vanishing toward the doors, Reed and Reese following behind like silent shadows, and Velvet Ember returned to its jazz music, to the awkward laughter of people pretending nothing had happened. But Wren remained frozen behind the bar, the USB burning in her palm, the white business card trembling beneath her fingertips, and from the far side of the room, she felt another gaze, searing the length of her back, a gaze she didn't need to turn around to identify, the gaze of the man who had killed her father 10 years earlier, now looking at her with the quiet suspicion of a snake that had just realized the mouse in its house might not be as simple as it had thought. At 3 a.m, when all of the French Quarter had sunk into that heavy silence peculiar to the very latest hours of the night, when even the last bars on Bourbon Street had gone dark, and the final drunks had staggered back to whatever nests awaited them, Wren Caldwell stepped out of a yellow taxi at the corner of Esplanade and Marais, the thin soles of her leather shoes scraping across worn red brick pavement, and walked the last 3 blocks back to her third-floor apartment in Tremé, with the gait of someone long accustomed to glancing over her shoulder. The front door of the old building had had a broken lock for 3 months, and the landlord still hadn't fixed it, so she climbed the creaking wooden staircase in darkness, with only one yellow bulb flickering weakly at the second-floor landing. And when she reached door 34, she inserted the key into the first lock, then the second lock she had installed herself last year, then the chain, then the metal bar she had bought from a second-hand store after her younger twin brother began drifting toward the wrong people. 4 layers of protection for a 600-square-foot apartment, with nothing worth stealing but a narrow bed, an old wooden desk, and all that remained of a family of 4, of which only she was left. When she flipped on the light, the weak yellow glow of the single incandescent bulb in the living room fell across the wooden floor, and the first thing she saw was a sheet of paper, torn hastily from a notebook lying in the middle of the dining table, a sheet she recognized instantly from the crooked, trembling handwriting of her twin brother, Teddy Caldwell, the brother who had shared their mother's womb with her for 9 months and 10 days, who had stood beside her at their father's grave at 18, who had drifted with her through 10 years of pain, and who had now left only 3 brief lines on that fragile page. They came looking for me. Don't look for me. I'm sorry, sis. Beneath the note lay a gray-brown envelope she didn't even need to open to know what was inside, because she had seen too many envelopes of that kind over the past 3 years, yet she still opened it with hands so numb they barely felt like hers. And the number printed in bold red ink on the statement struck her like a fist to the stomach. $80,000. With the words 72-hour deadline stamped diagonally across the paper in a red so dark it looked like dried blood. She stood there in the middle of the room, envelope in one hand, note in the other, and her legs, already exhausted from 12 hours on her feet behind the bar, suddenly gave out beneath her, and she slid down to the floorboards with her back against the table leg. And for the first time in 10 years since the night her father hadn't come home, Wren Caldwell cried, though without sound, without sobbing, without wailing, just tears running down both cheeks, as though someone had forgotten to turn off a faucet in an abandoned house, and memory came rushing at her with no order at all, only fragments, the spinning red and blue police lights reflected across the living room ceiling, the sirens fading and returning, the pale face of the police chief as he stepped into their house at 2 a.m. holding his hat in both hands, the way her mother collapsed onto the kitchen floor before she could even catch the chair beside her, and Teddy, only 18 then, standing in the bedroom doorway in his pajamas, not understanding what was happening, asking the same question over and over, in a voice already breaking into manhood. Where's Dad? Where's Dad? Where's Dad? She didn't know how long she sat on the floor before. Throat raw and tears spent, she dragged herself into the bedroom, pulled the old walnut box from beneath her bed, opened it with shaking hands, and inside, like a private altar she had built for herself over a decade, an old watch polished so carefully that it still gleamed beneath the yellow light. Beside it, a family photograph taken on a holiday in City Park when she and Teddy had been 7, her father in a blue shirt holding her high on his shoulders, her mother radiant beside him, everyone in that frame still alive, still healthy, still believing life would be kind to them. At the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in a square of white silk now yellowed by time, was a letter her father had written by hand to her the night before her high school graduation, 3 days before he died, and Wren unfolded it with the reverence of someone touching a sacred relic, reading lines she had memorized so thoroughly she could have read them in total darkness. My daughter, I know this world isn't always fair, and I know there'll be days when you'll feel like you're carrying the whole sky on your small shoulders. But remember this, sweetheart. Never stand alone when you can choose to walk beside someone decent. Being brave doesn't mean not needing anyone. Being brave means knowing when to hold out your hand. Love you more than words, Dad. Wren folded the letter again, laid it against her chest, and closed her eyes. Ronan Blackwood's white card was sitting on her bedside table, and for the next 2 hours she stared at it the way a person might stare into an abyss that might save her or swallow her whole, and every time she reached for the phone she pulled her hand back. Because what did an alliance with a man like that even mean? She had lived long enough to understand. It meant trading away some part of her soul for a chance at survival. It meant stepping into a world her father had spent his life fighting against. But then she thought of Teddy. lost somewhere in the city with men who wouldn't stop at anything. She thought of the $80,000 and the 72 hours already counting down. She thought of Sterling Pemberton's eyes burning into her back that night at Velvet Ember. And at last she thought of the line in her father's letter. Never stand alone when you can choose to walk beside someone decent. And Wren dialed the number. It rang once. A woman's voice answered, calm, precise, unsurprised, as if the person on the other end had been waiting for this call since the beginning of the night. Miss Caldwell, Mr. Blackwood is expecting you. A car will pick you up in 30 minutes. Wren went still, the phone pressed to her ear as if frozen there, because during the entire brief call she had never once said her name. When the line went dead, she slowly lowered the phone, rose, stepped into the small bathroom, turned on the cold water, splashed her face, then stood before the old mirror cracked in the lower right corner and looked directly into her own amber eyes, into the face she realized had grown much thinner than a year before, into the shadows under her eyes that had become as permanent as makeup that could never be washed away. And she brushed her hair up high, tied it into a neat ponytail, then whispered to the girl in the mirror, not really to herself but to someone standing behind her in the empty room, to the father who had been dead 10 years, to a memory, to a promise. Never stand alone. Dad, I'm listening now. Exactly 30 minutes after the call, a black Cadillac SUV stopped in front of the building in Treme, without a horn or any wasted sound. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out, nodded to Wren as though he had known her for years, and opened the rear door for her, with the quiet courtesy of a royal attendant. Wren climbed in carrying a small cloth bag that held exactly one change of clothes, a toothbrush, and the walnut box containing all that remained of her father, because she had no idea whether she would make it back to her own apartment that night, whether the sun would still rise on her roof the next morning, whether this journey would lead her toward salvation or push her into a pit deeper than any she had ever fallen into before. The car moved smoothly through the empty streets of New Orleans at 4 a.m, past Creole homes with wrought iron balconies, past the Seabrook Bridge spanning a silent ribbon of water, and she watched the city's yellow lights recede through the fogged glass, feeling as though she were leaving not just a place behind, but an older version of herself. About 40 minutes later, when the eastern sky had begun to turn the blue-gray of coming dawn, the SUV turned onto a private stone drive lined with 2 rows of ancient oaks, draped in Spanish moss, like veils of gray lace, and at the end of that drive stood a 19th-century French manor of white limestone and broad slate roof, with tall arched windows framed by climbing roses just beginning to open in the chill of early October. And beyond the house, Lake Pontchartrain stretched wide and endless like a silver mirror waiting for the sun. The front door opened before the SUV had fully stopped, and a woman in her early 60s with silver hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, dressed in a simple gray knit dress and a spotless white apron, stepped out as softly as a bird long familiar with these floors, smiling at Wren with a smile warm only at the corners of her eyes, never touching her lips, and introduced herself in a gentle Louisiana French accent. I'm Margaret, housekeeper to the Blackwood family for 23 years. Please follow me, Miss Caldwell. What surprised Wren wasn't the grandeur of the soaring foyer, filled with antique oil paintings and a baccarat crystal chandelier, nor the old Persian rugs so well kept they showed no sign of wear, but the fact that Margaret didn't lead her into the museum-like drawing room to the right of the entrance, nor into the severe study with double mahogany doors at the end of the hall. Instead, she turned down a narrow paneled passageway, descended 3 steps, and opened a door onto a spacious country French kitchen with a large oak table in the center, shining copper pots hanging from wrought iron racks, the smell of melting butter drifting through the air, and there, standing by the range with a kitchen towel slung over one shoulder, sleeves of his gray shirt rolled to reveal sun-browned forearms, was Ronan Blackwood. He looked up when she entered, with no remarkable expression at all, only a slight nod, as if her standing in his kitchen at 4:30 a.m. were the most natural thing in the world. Then he pulled a baking tray from the oven in one calm motion, set it on the marble slab, and sliced the steaming brioche into thick pieces with a serrated knife, while the scent of vanilla, browned butter, and orange zest filled the room like a comfort no words could fully describe. Sit, he said, gesturing to the wooden chair with gray linen cushions by the table. You haven't eaten in 20 hours. Eat first, then talk. Wren stood motionless at the kitchen door, her phone still clutched tightly in one hand, and she didn't know what made her pause more, The fact that the most feared man in the American Southeast was baking for her with his own hands, or the fact that he knew precisely that she hadn't eaten in 20 hours, down to the exact number, as if he had counted every rushed swallow of coffee between shifts. She sat. Margaret placed before her a cup of dense black espresso in delicate white porcelain and a plate with 2 golden slices of brioche spread with Normandy salted butter. And as she ate slowly, feeling each rich sip of coffee travel down her cracked, dry throat, Ronan leaned against the opposite counter drinking his own espresso, never urging her, never watching her eat, simply being there like a lighthouse in the middle of the night. When she had finished the second slice, she set down her cup and began to tell him about Teddy, about the 3 years her brother had been sinking further down the wrong road, about midnight phone calls and the times she had gone into the city's worst neighborhoods to drag him back out, and at last about the note on the table and the $80,000 bill with the 72-hour deadline. And when she spoke the name Sterling Pemberton, the knife in Ronan's hand paused in the air halfway through, slicing another piece of bread, and he set it down slowly, wiped his hands on the towel, and walked into the study. He returned in less than a minute, carrying a dark brown leather file worn at the edges from too much handling, set it before Wren, opened the first page, and she saw surveillance photographs of Sterling Pemberton taken through a long lens 6 months earlier. Then another, pictures of Sterling shaking hands with men in cheap jackets in alleyways, bank statements from the Caymans marked in red, and on page 21, Ronan pushed toward her a neatly typed list of 17 names, 17 people who had disappeared or met with accidents over the past 12 years, and the 5th line on the list read, Detective Harlan Caldwell, August 14th, code number 201-4HC-CLD. Wren felt the room tilt. When Ronan turned to the final page and set down an old black and white photograph taken at a police charity fundraiser 10 years earlier, her father standing in the corner in a suit a little too tight because he had put on weight after turning 50, Sterling Pemberton standing exactly 10 feet away, neither of them looking at the other, yet in the way Sterling held his champagne glass low like a hidden weapon, Wren finally saw what she had failed to see for 10 years, and Ronan said in that same unchanging voice, Your father was investigating Sterling when he died. I know because my father was destroyed by Sterling too, 3 months before your father. You and I have been walking the same road for 10 years without knowing it. The espresso cup slipped from Wren's hand, shattered into 3 large pieces and countless smaller ones on the marble, black coffee spreading like ink. And in that instant, when her heart seemed to stop, there came the light sound of small feet at the kitchen doorway. A boy of about 7 stood there barefoot on the cold floor, wearing blue dinosaur pajamas printed with Stegosaurus and Triceratops. His light brown hair rumpled with sleep, his gray-blue eyes identical to his father's, watching Wren without blinking, and in his hand he held a small black stone polished like dark water. Augie, go back out, Ronan said gently, but the boy didn't move. He kept staring at Wren, staring at the tears still wet on her face, at the trembling hands in her lap, and after a long silence in which Wren felt the entire room holding its breath, he crossed the floor in unhurried steps, came to stand beside her chair, and held out his small hand. In his palm lay the obsidian stone, polished smooth by childish sweat. For you, Augie said, his voice clear and small as a wind chime. You look sad. This is my calm stone. When I'm sad, I hold it, and it helps. Now I'm letting you borrow it. Ronan, still leaning against the counter, froze completely. The espresso in his hand, tilting so far that a drop of black coffee hit the wooden floor without him noticing, because in the 4 years since Marlene died, Augie had never, not once, given any of his precious stones to a stranger. Wren looked at the stone in the boy's palm, then at Augie's steady gray-blue eyes, and reached out to take it. The obsidian was heavier than she expected, smooth and cool, and when she closed her fingers around it, Wren Caldwell felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, not since the night her father died, not since the day her mother closed her eyes forever at Auctioner. Some iron lock inside her chest that had rusted in place over 10 long years suddenly shifted, loosened, and dissolved. After Augie left the kitchen with the quiet that belonged to children who understood far more than they ever should, Margaret quietly withdrew toward the hallway with a small nod that seemed to say she would remain nearby if needed, and suddenly only 2 people were left. Ronan Blackwood pushed himself away from the counter, said nothing further, only extended a hand in silent invitation for Wren to follow him, led her through a set of French doors at the far end of the kitchen she hadn't even noticed before, and at once the cold, clear air of an October dawn met her like a glass of ice water. The terrace behind the kitchen was broader than she expected, paved with wide gray limestone worn smooth by years, with a small, round, wrought iron table near the low stone balustrade, and stretching below them, less than 50 yards down the gentle yellowing green slope, lay the immense body of Lake Pontchartrain, its still surface catching the first pink-orange streaks of sunrise beyond the willows to the east, while a layer of silver mist still hovered over it, like the bridal veil of a bride who had waited too long. Ronan opened a small wooden cabinet mounted to the outer wall, took out a bottle of 12-year Redbreast Irish whiskey, amber gold through the glass like liquid sunlight, poured 2 fingers into 2 heavy-bottomed tumblers, and placed one in Wren's hand, without asking whether she drank whiskey in the morning. Because after a night like the one behind them, it wasn't really liquor anymore. It was medicine. They stood side by side at the stone railing in silence for a while, with nothing but the cry of white egrets crossing the lake and the distant start of a fishing boat engine. And finally Ronan spoke, his voice deep and clear like oak striking stone. He told her the Blackwood Syndicate had been tracking Sterling Pemberton for 8 months, that they knew he used Velvet Ember as one of the most sophisticated laundering engines in the Southeast, that on average, $400,000 dirty dollars passed through fake cocktail invoices and staged charity auctions in the second-floor VIP room every week, but that everything they had so far was circumstantial, financial patterns, connected routes, nothing that directly bore Sterling Pemberton's name strongly enough to put him in court. Wren took a sip of whiskey, felt honey and charred oak melt across her tongue, then set the glass on the stone rail, slowly drew the bean-sized USB from her coat pocket, placed it between them, and spoke in a voice steadier than she thought she still possessed. She told him that during the past 3 months, she had secretly copied data piece by piece from Sterling's secondary computer whenever he forgot his login password, that the USB contained the full list of suspicious transactions from the last 2 years, plus a map of money movement through 6 shell companies in the Caymans and Panama, but that the most important evidence, the evidence she believed could bury Sterling for good, was in a Liberty brand safe inside a hidden safe within the wine cellar of Velvet Ember, a room she had only entered 3 times in all the years she had worked there, and she knew for certain that inside was a black leather notebook Sterling always kept in his own hand during meetings with VIP clients, a notebook in which she had once glimpsed the name of a senator and a DEA official written beside 7-figure sums. Ronan listened without interrupting, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the brightening lake, and when she finished, he gave one small nod and said, still without looking at her, that he had an offer. He would protect her. He would bring Teddy back safely within the next 72 hours. He would deal with the $80,000 debt in such a way that no one would ever knock on her door again, and in return she would continue going to Velvet Ember exactly as before. No change in schedule, no change in demeanor, not one small detail altered that might make Sterling uneasy. And when the moment came, when his team was ready, she would be the one to open that safe for them. Wren stood still, looking at the amber whiskey in her glass, and asked the question she knew would decide whether she could trust him. "Why are you helping me? I have nothing except my own life." Ronan was silent for a long while, long enough for the sun to rise another degree beyond the willows and throw a slant of gold across the terrace stones, and still, without turning to face her, he said in a voice lowered almost to a whisper, that 4 years earlier he had not been home the night his wife had needed him most, that his son had been only 3 at the time, and that since that night he had sworn something to himself he had never spoken aloud to anyone, that for as long as he still had the power to stop it, he would never allow another innocent person to endure what Marlene had endured. He didn't speak his wife's name again. He didn't explain what had happened, but in the silence that followed, Wren understood she had just been shown a wound healed over in skin but never in bone, and she understood something else too, that the man beside her, the man whose name the whole city whispered in darkness, however dangerous he was to his enemies, to those who couldn't protect themselves, he was the last wall standing, the only light still burning on a street where every other lamp had long since gone dark. Wren set down her glass and extended her right hand. Ronan turned then, looked down at her small hand for 1 second, as though weighing the mass of a promise, and finally took it, his hand large and warm and rough, through the knuckles and palm in the way only hands that had truly lived ever become, and when her fingers closed around his, Wren was startled by something small but immeasurably important. Her hands weren't shaking anymore, not for the first time in longer than she could remember. Ronan released her, reached into the inner pocket of his vest, and placed a small black phone without any visible brand into her palm beside Augie's obsidian stone, then said, "This phone has only 3 numbers. 1 is my team. Anytime, anywhere. If you feel unsafe, press and hold. Someone will be there in 60 seconds. 2 is Catalin. She handles tech and data. 3 is me." When the SUV rolled back along the stone drive between the oaks close to 6 in the morning, the sun had fully risen, throwing long gold shafts through the Spanish moss across the hood of the car, and Wren sat in the back seat looking out the rear window to see Ronan Blackwood still standing on the front steps of the manor, hands in his pockets, watching the car until it vanished past the first bend. She slid her hand into her coat pocket and closed her fingers around Augie's obsidian stone, feeling the cool smoothness of the surface and the fading warmth left behind by the hand of a 7-year-old child. And for the first time in 10 years since the night red and blue lights spun across the ceiling of her house in Treme, Wren Caldwell sat alone in the back seat of a car without feeling alone. 3 days after that morning on the terrace overlooking Lake Pontchartrain, Wren returned to Velvet Ember with her shoulders straighter, the shadows beneath her eyes softened by the first full 6 hours of sleep she had managed in the safe hotel room Margaret had arranged for her in the Garden District, and in her coat pocket she carried the little black encrypted phone and Augie's obsidian stone, which she had already made a habit of touching whenever she felt herself unraveling. She entered the club at exactly 6 in the evening as always, tied on her leather apron, pinned up her hair, and through that entire first evening everything unfolded exactly as Ronan had instructed. No change in schedule, no change in attitude, no change in a single detail. But on the second evening, just after Wren finished her shift and began clearing the bar, Sterling Pemberton came down from his 3rd-floor office carrying a gift box wrapped in dark blue velvet paper and silver ribbon, set it on the bar in front of her with the generous smile she had known for 3 years, the smile she had once believed belonged to a benefactor and now knew belonged to a snake, coiled tight and waiting for its moment. "Dearest Renly," Sterling said in that honey-soft Louisiana drawl of his, "I know I've delayed this far too long. For 3 full years you've been Velvet Ember's finest employee. I thought it was time for proper recognition." When Wren opened the gift box with all the composure she had taught herself, inside lay a rectangular-faced Cartier tank watch set with stones, worth at the very least $8,000 by her estimate. And the first thing that came to her wasn't surprise, but a chill along the back of her neck. Because in 3 years of working for him, Sterling had never once given her any personal gift larger than a bottle of wine at Christmas. She thanked him with eyes carefully glossed over in counterfeit gratitude, slipped the watch onto her wrist right in front of him so he would see. And that night when she returned to the Blackwood estate, the very first thing she did was hand the watch to Catalin Vasquez, the Hungarian-American woman with cropped black hair and the sharp eyes of the former NSA specialist she truly was. Catalin opened the back of the watch with 2 delicate instruments under a yellow desk lamp in the basement, and in no more than 4 minutes, she held up before Wren and Ronan a tracking chip as thin as foil gum wrapper, a next-generation GPS unit with a microphone capable of recording within a 16-foot radius. "He started to suspect you," Catalin said in her calm, professional voice, "but not fully. If he were certain, you wouldn't have made it out of the club tonight." They decided to keep the watch exactly as it was. Wren would wear it every time she went to the club after work, take the watch back to the old apartment in Treme, then move to a safe place, giving Sterling the movement pattern of an ordinary employee living in Treme and working in the quarter. Over the next several nights, Sterling began inviting Wren into small meetings in the 2nd-floor VIP room with guests she recognized as some of the most powerful people in the city: a district judge, 2 state senators, a construction magnate with Department of Defense contracts, and he asked her to mix their drinks personally instead of allowing the assistant bartender to do what she usually did, an honor any other employee would have seen as a step upward in a career. But Wren knew exactly what it was. Sterling was placing her under the gaze of the city's most powerful eyes to mark territory, to send a message to anyone in his network: "This bartender belongs to me." On the 5th evening, after the VIP room had emptied, and only Sterling remained alone in the leather armchair in the corner, with a glass of 25-year-old Macallan in his hand, he called Wren over, told her to sit in the chair opposite him, and poured her a small measure from the same bottle, then began telling a story in the leisurely tone of a man reminiscing about old times, saying that 10 years earlier there had been a very stubborn young detective in this city, a truly honest man who believed he could drag an entire shadow into the light all by himself. "But Renly, my dear," Sterling said, taking a long, slow sip and looking directly into her eyes. "Some people imagine they can stand against the current of this city. It always ends the same way. A car accident, a modest funeral, a widow, 2 children without a father, and the Mississippi keeps flowing." Ren felt the blood inside her stop for one beat, but the hand holding her glass didn't tremble by even a millimeter. She drank the Macallan in one smooth swallow, set the empty glass down on the mahogany table with a soft click, looked directly into Sterling's cold, dark brown eyes, and smiled with the gentlest smile she could summon in her life, then said, "I only know how to mix drinks, Mr. Pemberton. Bigger matters aren't my place. Would you like another pour? You only just opened this bottle of Macallan." She lifted the bottle and refilled his glass with a hand, steady as stone, and Sterling laughed. But there was a glint in that laugh sharper than humor, the gleam of a razor waiting to test for blood. That night when she returned to the estate, Ren ran straight into the bathroom of her room, locked the door, and stood beneath scalding water for 20 full minutes, not bathing, simply letting it fall over her face to hide the tears she would not permit herself to shed in front of anyone. Not Margaret, not Augie, not Ronan. When she came out into the sitting room in a thick beige sweater with damp hair, Ronan was already waiting in the armchair beside the softly burning fireplace. He didn't rise. He didn't ask a single question. He only poured chamomile tea from a white porcelain pot and set it lightly in her hands. He saw the redness around her eyes. He saw that her hands were still cool, though she had just stood in hot water. But he didn't ask. He only said, softly, almost as if speaking to himself, "If you want to stop, we'll find another way. Nothing about this is mandatory." Ren held the warm cup in both hands, took a small sip, then shook her head with quiet certainty. "No, my father died because of that man. I have to finish what he left behind." Ronan didn't try to change her mind. He didn't repeat the offer. He merely nodded once, stood, and walked out of the room in long, measured steps. And Ren thought he had gone off to rest. But 30 minutes later, while she still sat staring into the fire, he returned, holding an old calfskin journal worn pale at the corners from use, and set it carefully on the table before her like a man laying down bone fragments. "This is my father Donovan Blackwood's investigation journal, from 2002 through 2014, he said. "He and your father knew each other. They exchanged information during the last 3 years. Your father sent copies of some of his material to mine before he died. I kept everything." Ren opened the journal with fingers that no longer felt like hers, and turned through the yellowing pages crowded with Donovan Blackwood's neat, hard handwriting. And then on page 63, she saw a slip of paper tucked between the leaves. And on that paper was handwriting she had not seen in 10 years. A slight, right-leaning script with the tails of the letter G curving upward in the way only her father ever wrote it. Dated August 11th, 3 days before he died. "Donovan, if anything happens to me, please take care of Evelyn and the twins for me. I trust you more than anyone else in the department. Harlan." Ren's tears fell onto the page before she even realized she was crying, and in that quiet sitting room with the soft crackle of the fire and the scent of oak smoke in the air, for the first time in 10 years, Ren Caldwell felt her father was still alive, not only in her own memory, but in ink on paper, in a connection she had never known existed, in the strange arrangement of fate that had carried her from a leaking apartment in Treme into this room, beside a man her father had once called brother. 2 weeks after the night, Ronan placed his father's journal into her hands. Ren Caldwell's life had been sliced neatly in half, like a lemon cut with the sharpest knife. One half the bartender Ren at Velvet Ember with her leather apron and soft smile for the city's powerful gentleman. The other half, a very different woman in the technical basement beneath the Blackwood estate, where she worked until 3 in the morning with a team she was slowly learning to call by first names instead of roles. Every night at the club she carried microphones, no larger than grains of rice designed by Catalin, hid them in the narrow seams behind the brown leather chair in Sterling's office, beneath the underside of the gilded brass desk lamp, behind the antique mirror frame mounted beside the liquor cabinet, replacing the batteries every Monday at 3 in the morning, when Sterling never came to the club, her heart beating like war drums, sweat slicking her fingers against the metal casings even in the air conditioning, while she counted 45 seconds in her head because Catalin had warned her that 45 seconds was the absolute safety limit before Sterling's rotating camera sweep returned to the place where she stood. When she reached the estate near dawn, she would often find Marcus the Ledger Abernathy bent over 3 computer monitors lined up in the basement corner, a man in his 50s with horn-rimmed glasses and neatly cut salt and pepper hair entering figures into spreadsheets with the speed of a concert pianist, while Catalin stood nearby with a small Vietnamese drip coffee slowly working into its cup, and the Donovan twins, Reed and Reese, split watch duties through the night. One stationed at the main entrance of the house, the other patrolling the lakeshore, never once sleeping at the same time. On the 9th night, after Wren began planting microphones, Catalin called the entire team to the center work table with one short grave motion of her hand. On the large screen before them was a list she had decrypted from the very USB Wren had handed over. 17 lines typed neatly in bold font, each line a name, a date, and an internal code Sterling had used in his personal records. Wren read from top to bottom, her eyes moving over names she didn't know: a city councilman from 2006, an investigative journalist in Baton Rouge from 2007, an accountant at a port shipping company from 2012, and on the 5th line, right in the center, plain as a scar across white paper, she saw Harlan Caldwell, August 14th, 2014, code 2014HC-CLD. This time Wren didn't cry. She had passed through that stage. Her tears had been spent on the floor of her Treme apartment, in the bathroom at the Blackwood estate. She only stood there looking at her father's name and drew a long, slow breath, then gave one slight nod, as if confirming something she had always known but had only now been given permission to say aloud. Ronan stood on her right. He didn't embrace her. He didn't offer an empty sentence of sympathy. He only rested his large hand on her shoulder for 1 second, firm enough for her to feel the weight of it, then withdrew it and said to the whole team in that low, steady voice they all knew, "We'll finish this, properly." From that night on, Augie began appearing more often during their late work sessions, wearing pajamas printed with mammoths or zebras depending on the night, carrying a green hardback sketchbook and a 24-color box of Faber-Castell pencils, no longer giving Wren stones, but instead drawing a new picture for her each evening. And every drawing featured a bear from what he called the Kingdom of Mossfield, a circular kingdom ringed by moss forests and silver streams, populated entirely by bears, each with a specific job and story. The first night he drew Elder Bear, an old bear with a beard woven through with daisies who kept the kingdom's history book. On the second, he drew Baker Bear, who made honey cakes for baby bears every morning. On the third, he drew Healer Bear, who could cure any wound with leaves and songs. Each night when Wren returned to the estate around 3 a.m, there was always a fresh drawing waiting on her bedside table, left there by Augie while she was still at Velvet Ember, along with a small note in his neat, childlike handwriting. "This bear's name is Thistle. Thistle likes peppermint tea. Thistle doesn't like noise." Wren began taping the drawings to the bare wall beside her bed with pale yellow masking tape, and after 14 nights, that wall had become a small gallery of 14 bears with 14 separate stories, each one with its own character and home in the moss woods, and every night before she slept, she looked up at that wall and remembered what she was fighting for. On the 15th night, while Wren sat at the work table in the small sitting room off the kitchen reviewing the audio files Caitlin had just given her, Augie walked in wearing blue whale pajamas, climbed into the chair opposite her, set down his newest drawing without turning it face down the way he usually did, and asked a question Wren had felt coming for several nights. "Miss Wren, are you going to stay?" Wren set down her pencil and glanced quickly toward Ronan, seated in the leather armchair in the corner with an open file on his lap. He didn't lift his head, but his hand had stopped midway down the page, and Wren knew he was hearing every word. She turned back to Augie, choosing her answer with care. "I don't know yet, Augie. I have to finish something first." The boy nodded with the solemnity of a tiny old man, then said, "That's okay. But if you stay, I'll draw you as a bear in the story." Wren laughed then, the first real laugh she'd given in many days, small but genuine, and asked, "What kind of bear would I be?" Augie studied her with his gray-blue eyes, head tilted in thought for about 3 seconds, then answered with complete confidence, "You'll be the bear who stands at the gate. That bear is really strong. That bear doesn't fight. That bear just stands at the gate. And because that bear is standing there, nobody dares come through. That bear protects the other bears by being there. Wren couldn't answer right away. She only reached out and smoothed the messy, light brown hair from his forehead. And when she glanced toward Ronan, this time he had raised his head and was looking at her. Not for long, but long enough. That night when the SUV returned her to the safe apartment in the Garden District, close to 4 a.m, Wren stepped into the bathroom, switched on the yellow light, and stood before the round mirror above the sink. The face reflected there was no longer the bartender hiding behind Velvet Ember's bar with tired eyes and the shadows of 3 jobs beneath them, nor the lost daughter of a murdered detective, but a woman whose eyes now knew exactly where she was and what she was doing. And in the golden quiet of the bathroom, Wren whispered to herself, "Gate Bear." On the 3rd Sunday since Wren Caldwell entered the world of the Blackwood family, for the first time in 17 straight days, she didn't have to tie on her leather apron and stand behind Velvet Ember's bar, because Sterling had personally texted her to take the day off to save her strength for guests arriving from Miami the following week. A generous concern she knew wasn't concern at all. And Ronan had left the estate before dawn with Reed Donovan on what he called only a matter I can't discuss, leaving behind a handwritten note in his strong, angular script on the breakfast table, saying he would be back before dark, and that Margaret had made ready anything Wren might need. When Wren had just finished her morning coffee in the sunlit breakfast room whose windows opened toward the eastern gardens, she heard Augie's little footsteps racing toward her, the boy dressed in blue denim overalls, a red and white striped shirt, and small sandals, a broad-brimmed straw hat on his head she recognized as his gardening hat, and he tugged at her hand with fingers still cool from milk. "Miss Wren, you don't have work today. I want to show you something. Can you come with me?" Wren let him pull her through the wood-paneled hallway, through the kitchen where Margaret was slicing green tomatoes for lunch, through the French doors leading into the eastern garden she had never yet explored, and when she stepped down the 3 limestone steps, she stopped for a second at the sight before her. It wasn't the decorative formal garden she had imagined wealthy people kept, but something more like a small map, divided into 5 separate sections by white pebble paths, each planted with different things, and at the entrance stood a small wooden sign, hand-painted in childlike blue marker letters that read, "Augie's Feelings Garden." The boy released her hand, stood very straight, with all the gravity of the youngest museum guide in America, and pointed to the nearest plot on the left, where pale lavender bushes were in bloom, releasing a cool, gentle scent. "This is the calm plants section. My mom taught me plants have feelings too. Calm plants smell the best, and their smell goes the farthest, because calm is something you have to share with lots of people before it becomes enough." He led her to the second plot, where sunflowers as tall as Wren's shoulders lifted their bright heads toward the morning sun. "This is the brave plants section. Sunflowers always look at the sun even when the sun is hot. Mom said being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means looking straight at what scares you." In the 3rd plot with basil and mint, Augie said those were the alert plants. In the 4th, with motherwort and chamomile, he called them the healing plants. And finally, in the largest plot at the back, where 3 tall magnolia trees rose with pure white blossoms above their dark green leaves, Augie stopped, and his voice dropped to a hush. "This is the Remember Mom section. My mom loved magnolias most in the whole world. Every spring I come sit here with her when the magnolias bloom." Wren knelt beside him on the flat stone beneath the largest magnolia, looking up at the waxy white flowers the size of open hands, and felt something in her chest slacken like a string suddenly released. Augie sat beside her, small legs crossed, and after a long enough silence he asked without looking at her, still staring up through the leaves, "Miss Wren, do you have someone you remember too?" It took Wren a moment to find her voice. Then she told him in a slow, even tone about the last morning her father drove her to school that August, about his old dark blue Crown Victoria police car he always parked at the far end of the lot so nobody would ding it, about the way he bent to tie her shoe even though she was already 18 because it was a habit neither of them had ever let go of since kindergarten, about the final thing he said when she opened the car door at the school gate. "Study hard, my Amber girl," and she told him she had waved back once and gone inside without looking over her shoulder again, never knowing that was the last time she would ever see him face to face. Augie listened without interruption, and when she finished he asked in the most serious voice a 7-year-old child could possibly manage, "What flowers did your dad like?" Wren let out a small broken laugh. "My dad didn't talk about flowers, Augie. He liked black coffee with no sugar. He liked the old New Orleans Zephyrs baseball team. He liked B.B. King blues. And he liked reading the Times-Picayune every Sunday morning. He wasn't a flower person. Augie thought about that for a very long time. His little brow furrowed into a line the way it did when he was solving something difficult. Then he stood up, dusted off the back of his overalls, and held out his hand to her. Then you need a different tree, not a magnolia. Magnolias are for my mom. I'll find one for you. He led her along the white pebble paths all the way to the far end of the garden, near the low wooden fence that separated it from the pine woods behind. And there stood a young oak, taller than Augie by 2 heads, its trunk still slender, leaves dark green already beginning to turn bronze at the edges with the early fall. An oak, Augie said, placing his small hand against the trunk. Oaks are the strongest trees in the woods. They live the longest. Their roots go so deep storms can't take them. Like your dad. Your dad was strong and straight. Your dad was an oak tree. Wren couldn't stop the tears then. They fell before she even knew they were coming. And she realized no one in 10 years had ever described her father in a way that felt so exactly right, because in all that time no one in her world had spoken of him with anything but empty condolences and pitying glances. Augie didn't look at her while she cried. He had learned from his father that when someone is crying, staring straight at them can make it harder. So he simply stood beside her with his shoulder touching hers, waiting in silence for the wave to pass. After a while, once Wren had wiped her face with her sleeve, he asked gently, "Can you plant your own tree? I think you need one." Wren sat down on a low stone step and looked up at him. "What kind of tree could I plant?" Augie lowered himself beside her, tilted his head, and answered with something she didn't expect. "You decide. The tree has to be like you. Not like your dad. Like you." Wren opened her mouth and then closed it again. For 10 years, she had been Harlan Caldwell's daughter, Teddy Caldwell's sister, Sterling Pemberton's best employee, the keeper of her dead father's unfinished dream, but Wren Caldwell by herself, without all of those names attached. She had never once taken the time to ask who that person really was. And now, beneath the oak tree in a feelings garden, designed by a 7-year-old child, the question struck her like a quiet wave. "I need more time to think," she finally said, and Augie nodded as though that were perfectly fine. "Okay, when you know, I'll help you plant it. I have a kid shovel and a grown-up shovel. Both work." Late that afternoon, when the sun had tilted west and the shadows of the old oak stretched across the eastern lawn, Ronan returned to the estate. He came through the foyer, through the sitting room, and as he passed the library, he stopped before the arched window overlooking the garden. Below, in the golden light of late day, Wren was sitting beneath the young oak with her arms around her knees, and Augie sat beside her telling some story with both small hands moving through the air, and Wren was laughing louder than the little laugh of the night before, a true laugh from someone who had not laughed freely in far too long. Margaret passed down the hallway carrying a silver tray with a tea service, and when she saw Ronan standing there, she paused, followed his line of sight, then said in her soft Louisiana voice, "Mr. Blackwood, it's been 4 years since I've heard that child laugh like that." Ronan didn't turn. He didn't answer. He only stood there unmoving in the last light of the day. But his right hand, that large, calloused hand that had once clasped Wren's on the terrace, tightened unconsciously around the wooden edge of the window frame, his knuckles whitening beneath sun-browned skin, not from fear of any danger outside, not from anything to do with Sterling or Velvet Ember or the 8-month investigation, but because of a feeling he had sworn to himself 4 years earlier, exactly 4 years earlier, he would never allow himself to feel again. 5 nights after the afternoon, when Augie had led her to the young oak tree, when Wren had already returned to her normal work schedule at Velvet Ember and was halfway through her 3rd consecutive shift of the week, something happened that she had feared for a long time but had never allowed herself to imagine too clearly. At 2 o'clock on Wednesday morning, just as Wren climbed to the 3rd floor to replace the last battery of the night in the microphone hidden behind the antique mirror frame, she heard the private elevator belonging to Sterling groan and stop on the 3rd floor, a sound she had never once heard at that hour in the past 4 months, because Sterling always left the club before midnight. She had less than 17 seconds to turn around, close the mirror casing, smooth the dust back across the wood grain exactly as it had been, and dart into the tiny storage room beside the corridor, a room no bigger than a small bathroom, packed with office supplies and paper boxes filled with old ledgers. She shut the door from the inside with the simple wooden hook and pressed herself into the corner behind the tallest stack of boxes, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it between her ears. Outside, Sterling's leather heels struck the wooden floor. He was speaking on the phone in that low voice of his, too muffled for her to make out the words, though the irritation in it was unmistakable. He entered the office, opened the safe, counted something, shut it again, then came back out, and his footsteps stopped directly in front of the storage room door, no more than 1.5 feet from her through the thin wood. There, Sterling Pemberton stood in silence for roughly 15 seconds, that felt to Wren like 15 years, drew in one deep breath, exhaled slowly, then turned and walked back toward the elevator, and disappeared. Wren didn't dare breathe until she heard the elevator descend all the way to the ground floor, and she remained in that pitch-dark storage room for another 40 minutes until Sterling's rotating camera had swept the hallway through 2 full cycles. Only then did she slip out through the staff door and step into the street on legs she could no longer feel. When the black SUV brought her back to the Blackwood estate at 4 a.m, Wren didn't go through the front door. She walked around to the back, to the rose garden beside the kitchen balcony where Ronan had poured whiskey for her 3 weeks earlier, and sank down on the limestone step, still wearing her velvet ember uniform that carried the scent of Cuban cigar smoke and the perfume of strangers. Her trembling hands rested on her knees, because she didn't want to go inside like this, didn't want Margaret to see her, didn't want Augie to see her, and most of all didn't want Ronan to see her weak like a child who had just fallen off a bicycle. But Ronan Blackwood, a man whose sleep had never followed the patterns of ordinary people, had been awake since 3 preparing waffle batter for Augie's breakfast, because that was his Wednesday morning habit, and when he stepped out onto the balcony to snip a sprig of rosemary from the pot near the railing, he saw her sitting there, one side of her ponytail coming loose, her shoulders trembling soundlessly. He didn't ask anything. He only descended the steps with the quiet gait of a man who didn't want to startle anyone, sat down beside her with exactly an arm's length between them, and remained that way for a full 10 minutes, without saying a word, without sighing, without questioning, without doing anything except being there. At the end of the 11th minute, he took off the dark brown leather jacket he was wearing and placed it over her shoulders in silence. The coat was still warm from his body, and smelled of dark roasted coffee and dried cedarwood, a strange scent that had become familiar to her over the past 3 weeks under the same roof. Wren drew in a long breath, and at last she told him everything. About the elevator at 2 a.m, about Sterling's 15 seconds outside the storage room door, about the 40 minutes she spent crouched in darkness among boxes of dusty old ledgers, and about the feeling, for the first time in 4 months, that she truly might not make it home. Not as a dramatic thought, only as a bare and quiet one, like a river passing by before she had time to swim. Ronan listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the far edge of the garden, where Augie's 3 magnolia trees were fading into the early mist. And when she had finished, he sat in silence for a while, then began to speak, for the first time in a voice Wren had never heard from him before. Not the voice of a boss, not the voice of a father, but the voice of an ordinary man. He told her that Marlene, his wife, had been a piano teacher at an elementary school in Baton Rouge, that they had met when she came to teach Augie the piano when the boy was 2, because a child psychologist had said music might help children with emotional difficulties, that Marlene had known perfectly well who he was and what he did, and that she had never once asked him to change, only asked one thing of him, that he must never allow Augie to choose between 2 worlds. On that night 4 years earlier, he had been downstairs in the basement working with Marcus on an urgent shipping file. Marlene heard a sound outside in the backyard shortly before 1 a.m. She didn't wake him, didn't call Reed or Reese who were on duty at the main gate. She went to check on it herself because she thought it was a stray cat and assumed she would shoo it away and come back in, and they came through the back entrance, through the garden, 3 men. He offered no more detail beyond a single sentence. She saved me, and Augie. If she had woken me that night, if I had gone up first, this would be a different story. After that, Augie stopped speaking for 8 months, 8 full months without a word, without a sound, without even an audible cry. The doctors believed the latent autism in him had been triggered by a psychological shock his 3-year-old mind couldn't process. When Ronan reached this part of the story, his right hand resting on his thigh unconsciously rubbed the plain silver ring on his ring finger, a habit Wren had noticed long ago but never asked about, and now she understood what that ring meant. "I swore I'd never love anyone again," Ronan said, his voice still calm as though he were reciting a report. "Not because I don't want to love, but because in my world, love becomes a burden for the person who's loved." Marlene accepted that burden without knowing how heavy it truly was. "I don't have the right to lay it on anyone else's shoulders. Wren said nothing for a long while. She only sat there breathing in the scent of the leather jacket around her shoulders and the early damp fragrance of the rose garden, then slowly lifted her right hand and placed it over Ronan's left, where it rested on the stone step between them. She didn't squeeze, didn't stroke, only laid her smaller hand lightly but clearly over his larger one, not as a gesture of romance, but of understanding, the kind of touch from someone who had walked the same road and was placing a hand on the shoulder of the person ahead to say, "I know, I'm here." Ronan didn't pull away, didn't move at all, only looked down at her hand resting on his, and the two of them sat like that for who knew how long, until the first yellow streak of sunlight poured through the eastern oaks and woke the sparrows in the lilac bushes. Wren said softly without turning to face him, "You may not have the right to love anyone, I understand that. But I have the right to care about you. That's my right, not yours." Ronan turned to look at her, and for the first time in many years, a man who always knew what to say in any situation couldn't find an answer. He opened his mouth, closed it again, opened it one more time, then only gave her hand the gentlest squeeze for the span of a single heartbeat before standing up. "Go inside," he said. "You need sleep." She nodded, but remained seated a little longer beneath the leather jacket still carrying his warmth, watching the sun climb fully over the oak line. And that night, when Wren finally lay down on the feather mattress in the eastern guest room of the estate, she dreamed. And for the first time in years, it wasn't a nightmare. She dreamed she was standing in a vast garden planted only with white magnolias, cool wind moving through them so that the petals drifted like spring snow, and she wasn't afraid anymore. 2 days after that dawn on the limestone steps, when Wren was mixing cocktails on Friday night at Velvet Ember, with hands far steadier than they had been the week before, the small encrypted phone in her apron pocket vibrated once with a short message from Catalin Vasquez, containing only 2 words. Found him. Ronan's team had located Teddy in an abandoned warehouse in the industrial zone east of the port of New Orleans, a district that 10 years ago had still been used for unloading fishing boats, but had now become a wasteland of collapsed tin buildings, sheltering people who had lost everything. Marcus Abernathy, though already past 50 and known more for financial spreadsheets than field work, had gone himself alongside the Donovan twins and a doctor, because he wanted to make sure Wren's younger brother was brought out of that place by hands that knew how to treat a human being with dignity. Wren wanted to go with them. She begged Ronan in a voice stripped of the calm she usually carried, but he shook his head with a firmness that wasn't cold. He told her she needed to remain at the estate, needed to prepare both the room and herself, that her being there wouldn't help Teddy now. It would only shame him more deeply in front of his sister, in a condition no younger brother would ever want her to see. The next 6 hours were the longest 6 hours of Wren's life. She paced the grand sitting room from the pendulum clock to the window overlooking the lake and back again, counting her steps so she wouldn't count the time. And Augie, after understanding the situation, from one brief sentence Ronan gave him, came downstairs in his sea turtle pajamas, climbed onto the large sofa beside where Wren sat bent forward, and simply stayed there beside her in silence, saying nothing, offering no drawings, offering no stones, only leaning his small shoulder against hers, because the boy had learned early that when someone is waiting for news that might shatter the heart, the only correct thing to do is be there. And Wren, without thinking, rested her hand on his light brown hair and said nothing, and they remained that way until the sound of tires on the gravel drive reached them at 11 that night. When the front doors opened, Marcus and Reed came in supporting a young man between them, and Wren froze at the foot of the staircase, because the person before her was no longer the cheerful twin brother who used to play baseball in the schoolyard at Warren Easton, no longer the 25-year-old who had once laughed beside her at their college graduation 3 years ago, but a gaunt shadow, black hair matted and unwashed, clothes hanging loose on a body that had lost nearly 20 pounds, dark circles hollow beneath eyes barely open, yet still aware enough to know his sister was standing there. Teddy looked at her, lips cracked and trembling, trying to say something his breath wouldn't quite carry, and managed only 2 words. "Wren, sis." Then his legs folded beneath him in the hall. Marcus and Reed caught him quickly, but Wren had already run forward, dropped to her knees on the polished wooden floor, and pulled her brother against her chest without caring about the smell of sweat, stale clothes, and days without bathing. She held him the way one holds a child and whispered into his hair, "I'm here, Teddy. I'm here. It's okay. It's okay." Dr. Henrietta Osei, a woman of about 45 from Ghana, with hair wrapped in a yellow silk scarf, gentle eyes, and swift hands, was already waiting in the recovery room in the eastern wing of the estate, a room Ronan had renovated into a small private infirmary, complete with a vital signs monitor, an adjustable hospital bed, and a carefully locked medicine cabinet. After examining Teddy for 30 minutes, she stepped out, closed the door softly, and said to Ren and Ronan, in a professional voice free of judgment, "He'll need 2 months of intensive treatment, but he'll be okay. His body is still young. What matters now are the first 7 days." The days that followed were the darkest of Teddy's life, and Ren sat beside him, holding his hand through each brutal hour when she was at the estate. But she couldn't stop going to work at Velvet Ember, because even one unusual absence would have allowed Sterling to connect the dots. So she told him that an aunt of hers in Baton Rouge had suddenly fallen ill, and she needed to visit her in the early mornings for the next 2 months, a reason ordinary enough not to raise suspicion, and Sterling had nodded magnanimously, and even offered her a week of paid leave, a generosity Ren understood was really a chain in disguise. By day she slept a few hours, by night she mixed drinks, and through the late hours into dawn she sat in the chair beside Teddy's bed, reading pages from Donovan Blackwood's investigation journal under the yellow bedside lamp, with one hand wrapped around her brother's. On the third night, when Ren was slumped forward on the side of Teddy's bed after a 12-hour shift at the club, the door opened softly, and Ronan entered, carrying a small wooden tray with a bowl of chicken soup made from bone broth and fresh ginger, still steaming, beside 2 slices of buttered bread. He set the tray on the bedside table and said only, "Eat. You can't help him if you collapse." Ren ate slowly, each warm spoonful moving down her throat like a truce between her body and the rest of her, and for the first time in 6 days, she truly tasted food. Ronan sat in the second chair in the corner and said nothing else, simply remained there, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. The next morning, when Ren entered the room and lifted Teddy's pillow to change the sheets as the nurse had instructed, she found a folded drawing tucked beneath it from the night before. Augie had slipped in while the house slept, and on the page were 2 bears, one large with a red scarf wrapped around its neck, embracing a smaller bear whose ears drooped low, and beneath the drawing in childish lettering were the words, "Big Sister Bear always hugs Little Brother Bear, even when Little Brother Bear stays sad for a long time." By the 7th day, Teddy had begun to clear. Ren brought him out to sit on the small balcony of the recovery room, overlooking the eastern garden. Teddy wrapped himself in a thick gray wool blanket, even though October in New Orleans was still warm, and the 2 of them sat facing each other in wicker chairs, and after a long while staring out into the garden, Teddy finally said, "Sis, I disappointed you." Ren reached across and took his thin hand. "You survived. That's all I need." Teddy broke then, crying for the first time in 3 years, his shoulders shaking beneath the blanket. "After Dad died, I couldn't take it. You were strong. You stood upright. I couldn't. I chose the wrong road because it helped me not feel anything." Ren stood up, moved around the little table, knelt in front of him, and gathered him into her arms. "Don't apologize. I was wrong too. For 10 years I thought not crying was how I loved you. But you didn't need a sister who never cried. You needed a sister who could cry with you. I'm sorry, Teddy. I'm sorry I stayed alone for too long and let you stay alone for too long." The 2 of them clung to each other and wept on the balcony of the Blackwood estate, weeping for their father, for their mother, for the dark blue Crown Victoria, for the funeral in August, for the 10 years they had drifted through like 2 boats without a compass. Above them, at the second-floor library window, Ronan Blackwood stood looking down at the scene in silence, and when Margaret passed carrying a tray of tea, he said, without turning his head, "Margaret, prepare the paperwork to place him at Willowbrook Recovery Center next week. I'll cover the full cost, and please call Mr. Harrison at the woodworking shop north of the lake. Ask whether he needs an apprentice. I have a young man who needs a trade, and a reason to get up every morning." 2 days after Teddy began to recover, and was moved into the healing suite on Dr. Henrietta Osei's structured treatment schedule, Ren was mixing drinks for a table of regulars when Catalin Vasquez sent a message to her encrypted phone consisting of only 3 words, Bordeaux 98. It was the code they had agreed upon at the beginning of the month, meaning Sterling Pemberton had left the club for a long dinner with his Miami investors at Brennan's, a dinner Catalin had tracked through reservations for 3 weeks waiting for exactly this opening. And now it had arrived. At least 3 empty hours on the 3rd floor. At least 3 hours for the duplicate key Catalin had copied from the original. Ren had borrowed on a night when Sterling forgot his document case on the bar. Wren watched Sterling's black Mercedes S-Class vanished past the end of the block, then asked the assistant bartender to cover for her for 5 minutes while she went to the restroom, and instead of heading toward the staff bathroom, she slipped quietly down the spiral iron staircase leading to Velvet Ember's wine cellar, an underground stone vault Sterling had built in the style of Burgundy, with 4,000 bottles arranged on marked oak shelves. She went straight to the farthest corner of the cellar, where behind a Bordeaux rack that slid aside with a hidden latch, there was a medium-sized Liberty safe built into the stone wall. She inserted the polished brass key Catalin had perfected through 3 separate tests, and the safe opened with a soft click after the 1-second delay Wren had held her breath to count. Inside was exactly what Catalin had predicted, and more. A thick black leather ledger with financial figures written in a 2-column code, a silk paper client list containing both real names and aliases side by side, and at the very bottom beneath 2 other files was a hard-backed folder in earthen brown, marked in bold black ink with a single word in all caps, Kingston. Wren pulled out the encrypted phone and began photographing each page methodically. Her hands quick, the flash already set by Catalin to silent, non-visible mode, and within 4 minutes, she had captured the black ledger and the client list. Then she opened the Kingston file. The first page froze her heart in her chest. It was a sharp color photograph of Augie Blackwood, walking out the gates of Riverside Episcopal School in Uptown, a small dinosaur stuffed animal in his hand, his light brown hair blown by the wind, the photograph clearly taken from inside a parked car about 30 yards from the school. The second page showed Augie in Audubon Park, crouching to watch a squirrel, while Margaret stood a few steps away looking at her phone. The third showed Augie eating strawberry ice cream at Creole Creamery on Prytania with Ronan beside him. Wren kept turning pages, faster now, her hand beginning to shake. A detailed diagram of the Blackwood estate's perimeter showing weak points, Margaret's and the staff's comings and goings listed by hour and minute, Reed and Reese Donovan's security shifts charted week by week, and on the final page, in the slanted, compact, hard handwriting Wren had already learned to recognize as Sterling Pemberton's, there was a short note in dark blue ink. Use the boy to force Blackwood cancel the investigation files and withdraw from the city. Deadline, 48 hours. The date at the top was the day before yesterday. Wren nearly dropped the phone when she heard footsteps on the spiral iron staircase. The heavy leather tread she would have recognized even in sleep, and she had only 7 seconds to close the Kingston folder, return it to its exact place, lock the safe, slide the wine rack back, and shove the phone into her apron pocket before turning toward the main Bordeaux row, pulling out a bottle of Chateau Margaux, 1998 from the 4th shelf up, just as Sterling Pemberton appeared at the final stair, his face flushed from wine, dark brown eyes half narrowed with fatigue, yet still sharp enough to sweep over Wren from head to toe. "What are you doing down here, Renly?" Sterling asked, his tone slow but never unguarded, and Wren looked up and smiled with the smile she had trained for 3 full years, raising the bottle like a shield. "Mr. Harrison at table 8 asked for this bottle. Mr. Pemberton. He said tonight is his 20th wedding anniversary. I came down myself instead of sending the new employee because you know how expensive this one is, and I didn't want any accidents." Sterling narrowed his eyes for 2 tense seconds, then nodded. "Fine. Go upstairs. Lock the cellar after you leave." As Wren passed him on the narrow staircase, her shoulder had no choice but to brush his, and in that instant, her nose caught the scent of costly red wine mixed with the unmistakable cologne Creed Millésime, Imperial, deep with bergamot at the top, wheat in the middle, and iris wood at the base. And Wren had read that scent once before, in the forensic report from the night her father died. It had lingered on her father's coat when his belongings were returned to the family 3 days later. A detail neither her mother nor the detectives investigating the case had considered important, but now it struck her like a blow to the stomach. She kept smiling, climbed the rest of the staircase, delivered the Margaux to table 8 with the most professional face she could summon, then told the floor manager she wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early. She untied her apron, ran out through the staff door, sprinted 2 blocks to the corner of Royal and Dumaine, and pressed button 1 on the encrypted phone. Reed Donovan reached her in 4 minutes, in the black SUV. He didn't ask a single question, only opened the back door and drove her straight out of the French Quarter across the Lake Pontchartrain route. Ronan was waiting on the manor steps when the vehicle arrived, wearing a black shirt with his sleeves still rolled, and when Wren handed him the encrypted phone and said only 2 words, "See Kingston," and he scrolled through the photographs, Wren saw, for the first time in her life, the granite calm of Ronan Blackwood crack. He didn't slam his fist, didn't shout, didn't make any grand gesture at all. He only turned slowly and walked toward the great window overlooking the lake. His two hands clenched so tightly the joints blanched beneath sun-browned skin, and his shoulders trembled exactly 3 times. Only 3. Before he stood utterly still like a stone figure for a length of time. Wren couldn't measure. Perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps 5. And she didn't go to him. She gave him the space he needed. When he finally turned back, the corners of his gray-blue eyes were red, but his voice had regained its calm, deep, and hard as cooled steel. "We end this. Tonight." He pulled out his phone and called Marcus and Catalin, ordered an emergency meeting that very night, and while he went downstairs to the basement war room, Wren remained at the sitting room doorway and looked into the room beside it, where the door to Augie's bedroom stood slightly ajar, and she could see the boy sleeping soundly on his small bed, a dinosaur-stuffed animal clutched in his arms, his chest rising and falling evenly beneath the faint blue glow of the crescent moon night light. Wren slid her hand into her coat pocket and pulled out the small, polished black obsidian stone Augie had given her in the kitchen 3 weeks earlier, the stone whose edges had worn smooth from how often she rubbed it when she was afraid, and she closed her fingers around it as tightly as she could, looking straight at the sleeping child through the crack in the door, and whispered, not to him, not to anyone but herself, "You'll be a gate bear. I promise. I won't let anyone touch you." Only a few hours before the operation began, as the whole estate had already begun counting down, Marcus Abernathy summoned Ronan and Wren to the basement war room at 5 o'clock in the morning with an expression that told them at once this wasn't good news. Across the 3 monitors in front of him were encrypted message threads Catalin had just intercepted between 2 Miami numbers, and Marcus reduced the heart of the information to one short sentence. "Nicholas Quinn is working with Sterling. They aren't rivals anymore. They're tactical allies, and they're planning a double strike." Nicholas Quinn, the 45-year-old boss who headed the Quinn family out in Metairie, had long been the sworn enemy of the Blackwood Syndicate, and the fact that he had joined hands with Sterling Pemberton meant the 2 most powerful forces in the city were now aiming at one single target, Ronan Blackwood and everything he loved. Wren sat beside the table with a cup of black coffee in her hand, and suddenly something in her mind sparked. She remembered a passage in her father's investigation journal that she had read over and over during those nights beside Teddy's bed, a passage about a case from 15 years earlier when Harlan Caldwell had still been a young detective. She hurried upstairs to fetch the worn brown calfskin notebook, flipped to page 41 that she had marked with a blue and gold ribbon, and on that page, her father's firm handwriting recorded a case from 2009, one he had investigated but never managed to prove, the murder of a real estate businessman named Anderson, who had agreed to meet Nicholas Quinn at a suburban restaurant to negotiate while his wife and daughter were attacked in their own home. And at the bottom of the page, her father's note in dark blue ink read clearly, "Quinn pattern. Always double. Always create one meeting to pull the target far away, then strike the place the target truly cares about. Need to verify against other cases." Wren carried the journal downstairs, placed it in front of Ronan, Marcus, and Catalin, opened it directly to page 41, and explained in a voice that had gone back to its calm, professional steadiness, "My father wrote about Quinn 15 years ago. He called it the double pattern. If Quinn and Sterling are planning a double strike, that means they'll create a fake meeting to pull Ronan away from the estate, while the real target is this house. It's Augie." Catalin cross-checked it against 3 other Quinn cases from the past 10 years over the next 20 minutes, and confirmed the pattern matched perfectly. Marcus nodded slowly. Reed and Rhys Donovan were called in and agreed after hearing the analysis, and Ronan, who had sat in silence at the head of the table the entire time Wren spoke, finally turned to look at her with an expression she had never seen in him before. No longer the look of a strategic ally, but of a man who had just been pulled back from a cliff edge he hadn't known, was opening beneath his feet. "You just saved my son," he said very softly, "and maybe my life too." The plan was adjusted immediately. Ronan would still go to the meeting with Quinn set for Wednesday night at a warehouse in Chalmette exactly as agreed, and act as though he knew nothing of the trap, but the Blackwood estate would be reinforced with the strongest defensive team the syndicate could gather. Reed Donovan would command the inside operation. A 12-man team would be stationed at strategic points along the fence line and the entrances. The shelter bunker in the basement would be reactivated after 4 years of disuse, and all security systems would be shifted to red status. That night, When the sun sank beyond the oak line and darkness spread over Lake Pontchartrain, Wren took Augie down into the shelter buried 10 feet underground beneath the eastern wing of the estate, a room built to bomb bunker standards, with thick concrete walls, a double bed, a work table, and a small, fully stocked refrigerator. Teddy was still weak, so Marcus helped him down and settled him against the wall with a wool blanket around his shoulders. And Augie, wearing pajamas printed with sea turtles, had brought his sketchbook and his box of Faber-Castell colored pencils. He sat in Wren's lap on the small bed, laid a sheet of paper across the cover of the notebook, and began to draw with the intense concentration of a child who didn't realize that above his head the entire family was sitting on top of a powder keg. Wren held him, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo in his hair, and for the next 2 hours they heard nothing except the soft hum of the bunker ventilation system. Then sometime around 11 that night, a heavy, violent crash carried down through the concrete walls, furniture overturning, glass shattering upstairs, footsteps running hard, and then a silence so long, Wren held her breath until her lungs hurt. Teddy sat against the wall with his eyes shut tight, one hand gripping the edge of his blanket. Augie, unaware of everything, kept drawing a bear in a red scarf standing guard at a door. After that silence that seemed to last forever, heavy, steady footsteps came down the concrete stairs, followed by the agreed knock code, 3 short, 2 long, and Reed Donovan's calm voice sounded through the door. "It's safe now. Open up." Meanwhile, at the Chalmette warehouse, 28 miles from the estate, Ronan Blackwood had realized from the first minute of the meeting that among Nicholas Quinn's 4-man escort, there was a man he had already seen in surveillance photographs from Velvet Ember the previous month, one of Sterling Pemberton's people pretending to be Quinn's assistant, and instead of reacting, he pretended not to notice, and continued the negotiation exactly according to the script. And when his men moved in to seize the whole group after the signal came from the estate that the attack had been stopped, the fake assistant was captured alive as a witness, the first direct evidence of the Sterling-Quinn connection. Ronan returned to the estate at 4:30 in the morning, his black shirt still dusty, a few blades of grass caught near the hem of his trousers, but not injured at all, and when he walked down the second-floor hallway toward Augie's room, he saw the door slightly ajar, and Wren sitting in the armchair beside the bed. The boy had fallen asleep 2 hours earlier, after Reed brought everyone back up from the bunker. One of Augie's small hands was still clutching the folded paper, with the drawing of the bear and the red scarf guarding the door, the other resting on his stomach as he breathed steadily. Wren stood when she saw Ronan, crossed the room through the dim glow of the nightlight, stopped in front of him, and simply lifted her right hand to rest it lightly on his shoulder, not squeezing, not stroking, only placing it there as if to confirm he was whole. "Are you all right?" Ronan closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, breathed in, then opened them and looked at her. "Thank you," he said, "for saving Augie again." The two of them stood in silence in the pale blue wash of the moon-shaped nightlight, and after a moment, Ronan spoke quietly, his voice lower than ever. "Wren, after tonight, I can't pretend you're only an ally to me anymore. I don't know what to call this, and I'm not making promises, but I can't pretend anymore." Wren didn't turn to look at him. She only nodded once, removed her hand from his shoulder, and walked out of Augie's room, closing the door behind her very softly. When she shut her own bedroom door at the end of the hallway and leaned back against the wood, her right palm pressed flat to the panel in the darkness, Wren Caldwell smiled for the first time in many days, a small private smile that no one in the world saw but her. The next morning after the attack, the sun was already high above the ancient oaks when Wren finally opened her eyes. The small clock on her bedside table read 10:10, the latest she had slept in months, and the entire estate lay wrapped in the kind of silence that belongs to a house that has just survived a great night and where everyone is still trying to sleep afterward. She pulled on a thin cream sweater and soft gray cotton trousers, tied her hair high, and padded barefoot down the wooden staircase, with one thought in her mind: coffee. She crossed the wood-paneled hall still cool because the sunlight hadn't yet reached it directly, and when she pushed open the kitchen door, the first scent that met her wasn't coffee at all, but brown butter melting in a pan, with toasted baguette and the faint brightness of fresh rosemary. Ronan Blackwood stood at the gas range, gently tilting a small nonstick pan. The sleeves of his white shirt rolled back evenly, a blue and white striped kitchen towel over his shoulder, and on the cutting board in front of him sat 3 eggs whisked with a spoonful of cream and a few finely chopped sprigs of thyme. He glanced up when he heard her footsteps, gave a small, quiet nod in greeting, and slid toward her a cup of espresso already poured into a thin, white porcelain cup. Ren stepped closer and sat on the high stool at the kitchen counter, wrapping both hands around the cup as if receiving a small flame, and asked in the raspy voice of someone just awake, "Didn't you sleep?" Ronan kept tipping the pan so the eggs rolled smoothly without turning around. 2 hours. Enough. I'm used to strange hours. He slid the finished eggs onto a white plate, cut 2 crisp golden slices from a loaf of baguette, still steaming, spread them with a thin layer of Normandy salted butter, and set everything in front of her with a small side plate holding 3 fresh strawberries and a thin slice of orange. Ren looked at the folded omelet, perfect as a little pale gold letter, and realized this was the first time since her mother was alive that anyone had actually cooked a real breakfast for her instead of handing her a rushed sandwich from a vending machine. "My mother was Sicilian-Italian with Irish blood," Ronan said, pouring himself a second espresso. "She lived in a small town near Palermo until she was 20, then came to New Orleans. She taught me how to cook when I was 7, the same age Augie is now. She said a man has to know how to cook, because that's the only way to make sure his family doesn't go hungry no matter what kind of storm comes." Ren took a bite of the eggs and closed her eyes for a second, because the softly sweet taste of brown butter and creamy eggs dissolving on her tongue felt like someone singing a song meant only for her. At that exact moment, Augie's little footsteps came racing down the stairs, and he appeared in the doorway in stingray pajamas, one arm wrapped around his stuffed dinosaur, his hair sticking straight up on one side and flattened on the other, and he stood there for exactly 3 seconds, with the expression of an explorer discovering a new continent, because seeing Ren and Ronan eating breakfast together at the kitchen counter at 10 in the morning was something he hadn't seen since his mother was alive. He climbed onto the stool between the 2 adults without hesitation, set the dinosaur on the counter like a 4th guest, and asked with the practicality of a child, "What is Dad making?" "Grandma-style eggs. Do you want some?" Augie nodded solemnly, then turned to Ren. "Do you know how to make eggs like this?" "I've never learned, Augie," Ren answered honestly. "Back home breakfast used to be Cheerios with cold milk. My mom left for work at 6, my dad at 5:30, so we got it ourselves." Augie thought for 2 seconds, then said with complete decisiveness, "Then Dad should teach you. I'll help. My dad is really good, but he doesn't cook much because he's sad." Ren glanced quickly toward Ronan, and he was very deliberately not looking at her, concentrating on reheating the pan. So the 3 of them started another batch of eggs. Augie cracked 3 fresh eggs into the glass bowl with tiny but determined hands. Ronan showed Ren how to cube the butter and drop it into the pan once it was hot enough but not smoking. Ren learned to tilt the pan so the butter coated the bottom evenly, and when the eggs began to set, he placed his hand over hers on the handle to show her how to fold the edge inward. It was the first time their hands touched without fear or urgency, and neither of them pulled away. The air in that morning kitchen smelled of melting butter and cooling baguette. There were songbirds calling outside the open window, a distant fishing boat starting its engine on the lake, and for the first time in many years, Ren Caldwell felt something she didn't dare name. Something the only word she could find for was belonging somewhere. While the eggs finished cooking, Augie suddenly said in the calm tone he might have used to comment on the weather, "Miss Ren, Dad doesn't laugh much since Mom died, but yesterday I heard him laugh twice. Once when you slipped in the garden last week, once when you were talking to someone on the phone, and he was standing outside the library door listening and laughed quietly." Ronan dropped the nonstick pan onto the stovetop with a clatter loud enough to fill the kitchen, and Augie continued as if he hadn't noticed, "I like it when Dad laughs. So if you make him laugh, I need you to stay." Ren turned to look at Ronan, and this time he didn't look away. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before, not the look of a boss, not the look of a father, but the look of a man who had just seen a window he believed was sealed forever crack open by an inch. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but just then the estate doorbell rang 3 short times in a row, the signal from the outer gate Catalin had set for urgent visitors, and through the kitchen window, Ren saw Marcus Abernathy climbing the front steps with a brown leather file case in his hand. Ronan let out one short breath, gave an apologetic nod, and walked out to the foyer. After he left, Ren finished folding the omelet she had been making, and Augie leaned closer to her and whispered at her elbow with the look of a co-conspirator, "Don't worry, Dad is really slow about things like this, but he never forgets." The omelet Ren made that morning, with the help of a 34-year-old man and a 7-year-old child, was the best omelet she had ever eaten in her life, not because of the recipe from a Sicilian grandmother who had died 4 years earlier, but because she ate it with 2 people who had slipped into her heart without her even realizing it. That night, when the whole estate had gone dark, Wren sat on her bed with the small leather notebook she had bought the week before at a used bookstore on Royal Street, opened the blank first page, lifted her fountain pen filled with dark blue ink, and wrote exactly 1 line, only one. Maybe another life is waiting for me on the far side of this storm. The call Marcus Abernathy brought that morning had come from Special Agent Daniel McKinnon of the FBI's New Orleans field office, a 50-year-old man with a silver mustache and tortoiseshell glasses, whom Ronan had been quietly working through for 6 months by way of a Baton Rouge attorney, and the short message he sent was only 1 sentence: "We're ready. The entry team will be waiting for your signal any time after 8 p.m. tonight." That was the number Wren stared at all through the emergency meeting in the basement that morning. 24 hours to lay the trap, 24 hours to end the network that had stolen her father from her 10 years earlier. Ronan laid out the plan, in that even deep voice of his, as though reading sheet music, saying that he would personally call Sterling Pemberton at noon and request a business meeting for 8 o'clock that evening in the second-floor VIP room of Velvet Ember, that he would offer a peace deal Sterling had waited for a very long time to hear, handing over part of the eastern shipping territory to Sterling's network in exchange for an end to hostilities and a non-interference pact, an offer generous enough that Sterling couldn't dismiss it, but vague enough that he would have to ask detailed questions. And those very questions, if guided the right way, would give Wren, standing just behind the bar in the VIP room with a hidden recording microphone, the chance to capture every confession Sterling made about money laundering, murders, and the newly confirmed link to Nicholas Quinn. Catalin Vasquez would handle shutting down Velvet Ember's camera system at the exact moment Ronan gave the signal by rotating his whiskey glass twice, counterclockwise. Reed and Rhys Donovan would enter the club posing as Ronan's private security and stand at either side of the VIP room door to guarantee Wren's physical safety, while Agent McKinnon and his 18-person FBI team waited in 2 unmarked vans parked exactly 3 blocks from Velvet Ember, ready to move in within 60 seconds of Catalin's signal. Back at the estate, Marcus would command the remaining 12-man team. Augie and Teddy would be brought down to the bunker the moment Wren left the estate at 7 that evening. Margaret would stay with them all night, and every outside entrance to the estate would be completely sealed by armed personnel. On the morning of the fateful day, as Wren was laying out her work clothes in her bedroom, Augie knocked 3 times in the rhythm he had invented for himself, then pushed the door open wearing starfish pajamas and walked straight to her, wrapped both little arms around her waist, pressed his face into her side, and spoke in a voice already thick with tears before she could react. "You can't go. I think today isn't safe. I feel not safe." Wren knelt down on the wooden floor, took hold of his small shoulders, and looked straight into his shining blue-gray eyes. "Augie, I have to go. This is the last night. After tonight, nobody will threaten you and your dad anymore. But I promise you, I'll come back. Do you remember the stone you gave me?" She reached into her apron pocket, took out the smooth black obsidian worn dull at the edges, set it in his palm for 1 second, then took it back so he could see she still carried it. Augie nodded but didn't let go of her. Instead, he pulled a folded drawing from the pocket of his pajamas, a little square the size of his palm, and held it out to her. "Take this. It's a picture of 3 bears. 3 bears standing next to each other, all facing outward toward the road. You're the bear in the middle. Take it so you'll be safe." Wren unfolded the paper. On it were 3 bears drawn in colored pencil standing in a row. The one on the left, large and dark-furred, the smaller one on the right, wearing a red scarf, and the bear in the middle with amber eyes and warm golden-brown fur. All 3 holding hands in an unbroken chain. Wren couldn't stop the tears this time. She hugged Augie for a long time, long enough to breathe in the child shampoo in his hair and memorize it, and then she felt another pair of arms coming around both of them from behind. Teddy, much stronger now after 10 days under Dr. Osei's treatment, stood at her back and wrapped both arms around them, rubbing his face against her shoulder the way he had as a little boy. "Sis, I'm sorry I wasn't as strong as you these last 10 years. I can't take your place tonight, but I'll be here waiting when you come back. I won't disappear again." Wren turned and held them both, one a younger brother, one a child, and she promised in a voice clear and steady. "Tonight we'll all eat dinner together. Everyone. Margaret will make something simple. I want the 4 of us around one table. Do you understand, Augie?" The boy nodded, and Teddy nodded too. By 7 that evening, Wren was fully dressed in her velvet ember uniform, white-collared shirt, slim black trousers, brown leather apron, hair tied up neatly, and Catalin fastened the tiny microphone to the edge of her collar with such skill that even Wren couldn't feel it there. Before she got into the car, Ronan called her into his study, closed the door behind them, and without saying anything first, crossed to a small wooden cabinet in the corner, took out a black velvet box, and opened it to reveal a thin silver chain with a simple cross pendant. No engraving, no gemstone, only a plain sterling cross the length of a knuckle, and he placed it in her palm. This isn't religious, Wren. It's the newest emergency GPS and microphone device Catalin has. If anything goes wrong tonight, anything at all you have to do is snap the cross in half with 2 fingers. And in 60 seconds, 18 FBI agents and 8 of my people will be there. Wren slipped the chain around her neck and tucked the pendant beneath the collar of her shirt. You be careful too. Quinn already lost once. This time Sterling won't let you leave the VIP room easily if he senses anything is wrong. Ronan looked at her for a long time in the yellow light of the study, long enough for her to see he was searching for the right words. Wren, if tonight doesn't go the way we planned. She lifted her forefinger and rested it lightly against his lips. Not a kiss, not a romantic gesture, only a quiet way to stop him from finishing the sentence, because that sentence wasn't allowed to exist tonight. There is no if, Ronan. I promised Augie. The 3 of us have a family dinner waiting here, and I don't break promises to children. Ronan smiled then, a small smile that reached only the corners of his eyes, but it was the first real smile he had given her since the day they met. The 2 black cars left the Blackwood estate at 7:15 that evening, the first taking Wren back to the French Quarter across the Lake Pontchartrain route so she could begin her shift as though it were an ordinary night, the second carrying Ronan by another road to Velvet Ember at 7:50, 2 different directions leading to the same destination. On the final night of the old New Orleans they had all come to know, with the estate behind them, and 3 people inside it who understood exactly that. At 9 o'clock that night, Velvet Ember was at the height of an ordinary Wednesday evening. The saxophone from Desmond Lafitte's jazz quartet winding through the low aching notes of autumn in New York, Cuban cigar smoke drifting through the air with the scent of warmed cognac, and the expensive perfume of pearl-draped ladies talking in red leather chairs. And Wren Caldwell was mixing a Sazerac for a regular customer, a surgeon from Oxnard Hospital, her movements as smooth as though nothing were different from 1,000 other nights in her life behind a bar. But beneath the crisp white shirt, her heart pounded so hard she felt certain anyone standing near her could hear it, and the silver cross hidden beneath her collar felt heavier than anything she had ever worn. At exactly 9:30, the oak door opened, and Ronan Blackwood stepped in with Reed and Rhys Donovan, and this time he wasn't dressed in black, but in a dark graphite suit hand-tailored on Savile Row, a white shirt with no tie, and there was something different in his walk tonight. The measured calm of a man moving toward the end of a story he had been writing for 6 months. Sterling Pemberton appeared from the VIP room with the generous smile Wren knew too well, shook Ronan's hand with both of his as if they were old friends, and led him up the wrought iron spiral staircase to the 2nd floor, while Wren, exactly as planned, prepared a silver tray with 3 drinks, an old-fashioned for Ronan mixed the old way with no sugar and no orange, a glass of 25-year-old Macallan for Sterling as usual, and a cold bottle of Perrier for any third person who might be present. She carried the tray upstairs, pushed open the thick glass door disguised beneath polished mahogany veneer, and entered the VIP room, a completely soundproof chamber with 3 wine-colored Chesterfield leather chairs, a round mahogany table in the center, and a small marble bar in the corner where she had been assigned to stand and serve through the meeting. From an unmarked van parked 4 blocks from the club, Catalin Vasquez had already cut into the camera system of the VIP room and was feeding every image live to Agent McKinnon's server. The conversation began with polite talk about the Mississippi real estate market, about a duck hunting trip Sterling had taken the week before in Arkansas. And then Ronan gradually moved to the real subject, offering a peace agreement, one that would hand over part of the Eastern Shipping Territory to Sterling in exchange for an end to hostilities between their organizations. Sterling laughed loudly, took a sip of Macallan, and his dark brown eyes glittered with a sharp-edged amusement. Blackwood, I truly don't understand why you're bending this much. What's going wrong on your side that I haven't heard about yet? Ronan turned the old-fashioned lightly in his hand, his eyes never leaving Sterling. This city is too small for both of us, Pemberton. I have a son. I'm old enough now to want him to grow up without seeing his father behind bars." Sterling nodded with mock admiration, drank another long swallow, and Ronan, with the subtle skill of a man who had read people for 20 years, gently guided the conversation toward the past. He said, almost as if making small talk, that he had heard there was once a detective from the New Orleans Police Department who had investigated Sterling 10 years earlier, and that the matter had been handled very neatly. Sterling, already on his third Macallan, and sinking deeper into the leather chair, with the arrogance of a king certain he was winning, gave a contemptuous laugh. "Caldwell. Yeah, I remember him. Hard-headed as rock. But rock breaks too, Blackwood, if you know exactly how much force to apply in the right spot. My wife knew his wife, knew her schedule, and that was that. Easier than that Bergeron reporter back in 07. Wren, standing behind the marble counter, had to grip the edge of it so hard with her left hand that her nails went white, but her face didn't shift by even a fraction. She kept polishing a crystal glass with a white linen cloth, her motions as steady as a clock. Sterling, now truly drunk on both whiskey and his own smugness, started listing names. A federal judge, 2 state senators, a retired deputy police chief, and with every name he told a little story about the money exchanged and what it had bought him in return, enough to convict him to 3 life sentences with no parole. Ronan slowly rotated his whiskey glass 2 turns counterclockwise, the signal Catalan had been waiting for, and there were only 90 seconds left before Agent McKinnon and his team would storm in. Everything was going perfectly, until the glass door burst open and a man named Jenkins charged in, pale-faced and breathless. Jenkins was Sterling's head of security, the man who had reviewed the third-floor camera footage that afternoon and had just recognized Wren's face. "Boss, the bartender girl. 2 nights ago she went through your safe in the wine cellar. I just watched it back." In a single second, Sterling sobered. His dark brown eyes snapped toward Wren like twin blades, and he hissed through his teeth. "The girl, Caldwell's daughter," and lunged for her. But Ronan had already moved faster, throwing himself between them. For one instant, the room dissolved into chaos. Objects crashing, bottles rattling on the shelves. Reed and Reese taking Jenkins down in 3 seconds flat. Ronan blocking Sterling with his whole body, but Sterling still tried to push around him toward Wren. She didn't think. She only reached behind the marble bar, grabbed the neck of a large bottle of Hennessy XO, and slammed it hard against the edge of the mahogany table beside Sterling. The crack of breaking glass and wood exploded together in a deafening burst, startling him just enough that he stumbled, lost his balance, and fell backward into the leather chair behind him. At that exact moment, all 3 exits of the VIP room burst open at once. Agent McKinnon and his 18-person team stormed inside, barking sharp commands. Sterling was cuffed right there in the chair while still spitting curses that no longer formed complete thoughts. Jenkins was taken too. And in the middle of that chaos, Wren realized Ronan was leaning back against the edge of the table, one hand pressed to his left side where a small red stain the size of a coin was spreading through his white shirt. A cut from a shard of broken glass that had sliced him while he was shielding her. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "Are you okay?" Ronan smiled, half tired and half relieved. "I told you. I don't miss an appointment." Wren laughed then, and tears spilled down her face without her trying to stop them. "Augie and Teddy are waiting for us. I promised them a family dinner." Outside on the street, the sirens of 5 police cars screamed from the far end of Bourbon Street. And when the FBI medical team arrived to examine the cut at his side, Ronan refused to go to a hospital. He only asked to be bandaged there on site, because back at the estate by Lake Pontchartrain, there was a little boy in starfish pajamas and a family dinner waiting, and tonight that was the only place he needed to return to. At 2 a.m, when the black SUV carried Ronan and Wren back across the Lake Pontchartrain bridge toward the estate, the eastern sky was still dense with the blue-black color of deep night, and through the entire 40-minute drive from the French Quarter back to the North Shore, the 2 of them sat in the rear seat without speaking. Only Wren's left hand resting lightly over Ronan's right, lightly enough that if he had wanted to pull away, he could have done so at any time, but he didn't. Margaret was waiting on the front steps in a thick wool robe, a silver tray already prepared in the downstairs bathroom with hot water and a box of medical supplies, and she didn't ask a single question when they stepped out of the car. She didn't ask how the meeting had gone, didn't ask whether Sterling had been arrested, didn't ask about the red stain on Ronan's shirt. She only nodded and led them into the small guest bathroom off the foyer. Ren opened the medical kit herself, took out a sterile gauze pad, poured saline over it, and when Ronan sat down on the low wooden chair and unbuttoned his shirt to reveal the cut, about 2 inches long across his left side, she knelt on the tiled floor, looked up at him for a second, then began cleaning the wound with slow, gentle motions. It was the first time she had touched his skin directly, not through a hand, not through the cloth of a sleeve or shoulder, but truly touched the sun-browned skin beneath the fabric, and in that moment there wasn't a trace of romance in it, not a single physical tremor, but something deeper than an embrace. The intimacy of two people who had walked through a long night together and were now helping each other return to the ordinary shape of themselves. When she placed the final clean bandage over the cut, Ronan gave her a quiet nod of thanks, and they stepped into the sitting room just as Teddy's familiar slippered footsteps came down the stairs. Teddy descended in a loose gray t-shirt and cotton sleep pants, his eyes still hazy with sleep, but fully awake the instant he saw his sister, and he rushed to Ren and wrapped both arms around her shoulders. Ren felt that her brother had regained the solid weight of a grown man, no longer the gaunt shadow Marcus had carried into the estate 15 days earlier. "Is it over, sis?" Teddy asked, his voice still rough with sleep. "It's over," Ren answered, smoothing his hair. "Dad would be proud." Teddy nodded, his eyes shining with tears, but he didn't cry. He only held her a few seconds longer, then stepped back to look her over from head to toe, as if needing to confirm with his own eyes that she had come back whole. Behind them, on the staircase, came the small, soft steps of Augie, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, starfish pajamas wrinkled, stuffed dinosaur tucked beneath one arm, and he stopped on the last stair and looked at Ronan, then at Ren, and his blue-gray eyes lingered longest on the white bandage peeking from beneath his father's shirt. "Does it hurt, Dad?" "Not too much, son," Ronan said, kneeling to the child's height. "Miss Ren took care of me." Augie considered that information in silence for about 3 seconds, then walked to the large sofa, climbed onto the middle cushion, and patted both sides beside him twice, a clear invitation for Ronan to sit on his left and Ren on his right. And when both adults had sat down, Augie leaned his head against Ronan's shoulder, reached out with one small hand to hold Ren's index finger, and that was how the three of them sat together on the gray linen sofa in the glow of the low fire. No one speaking, no one needing to, only the sound of pine logs crackling and the pendulum clock in the foyer counting toward 4. Teddy made a pot of chamomile tea with a spoonful of honey at the kitchen counter, brought out 4 white porcelain cups, set them on the table, then took the armchair beside them, and the whole world seemed to shrink to the exact size of that one room. At 5 in the morning, when the first hint of dawn began to change the windows overlooking the lake from blue-black to blue-gray, and then to pale rose, Ronan's phone vibrated on the table, and when he switched to speaker, the whole room heard Agent Daniel McKinnon's voice come through clearly. "Ronan, Sterling Pemberton has been formally indicted on 47 charges, including 7 counts of intentional murder. Nicholas Quinn was arrested in Metairie a few hours ago. We've contacted all 17 victim families, including the Caldwell family. The Caldwell family is first on the list. I'll come to the estate at 8 this morning if Miss Caldwell agrees." Ren nodded toward the phone, even though McKinnon couldn't see her, and said only 2 words, "Thank you." At 8 o'clock, McKinnon arrived with a younger colleague. He wore a gray suit and carried a square brown craft envelope. After a few formal words and a solemn handshake, he placed the envelope on the coffee table in front of Ren. Inside was Detective Harlan Caldwell's silver-plated brass police badge, badge number 472. The physical evidence Sterling had kept locked in his private safe for 10 years, like a silent trophy. Ren lifted the badge in both hands, and this time she trembled, not from fear, but because this was the first time she had touched it in 10 years. Ronan sat beside her and closed his hand gently over hers while she held the badge. "Your father would be proud, Ren." Augie, who had been sitting on the rug near the fireplace drawing, stood up and walked over barefoot and held out a small, pale blue stone shot through with fine white veins. "Aquamarine. Stone of the sea. I saved it for you since last month. I think you're like the sea, strong but with lots of sadness underneath. But now I think you aren't sad anymore." Ren took the stone and pulled him into a tight embrace. "You're right, Augie. I'm not sad anymore." Ronan watched them for a moment, then stood and stepped out to the back terrace. Ren set the badge down and followed him. They stood side by side on the familiar limestone step, where so many dawns had begun, and Ronan said without turning toward her, "Ren, stay." She didn't answer at once. She looked out across the brightening surface of Lake Pontchartrain, where mist drifted lightly like the breath of some gentle creature, and finally she said, "Ronan, I need time. I need to stand on my own feet before I stand beside anyone." He nodded, with no disappointment, no pressure. "I'll wait. No rush." She placed her right hand over his left. No promise in it yet, only a single nod, and for the first time in 10 years, Ren Caldwell knew she didn't need to run anymore. 8 weeks after that morning on the limestone steps, when Ren laid her hand over Ronan's and said she needed time, spring had come to New Orleans in the way only that city knows. Suddenly and lavishly, the magnolias along St. Charles Avenue bursting white for one brilliant week, the morning air carrying jasmine and wild orange blossom, and on the morning of April 12th, at Lafayette No. 1 Cemetery in the Garden District, the New Orleans Police Department held the official memorial. Detective Harlan Caldwell had been denied 10 years earlier, with all the honor due to badge number 472. Ren stood before her father's grave in a simple black suit, her ponytail tied low, holding a bouquet of bright yellow sunflowers instead of funeral lilies because her father had loved the color of sunlight. And when the trumpet sounded, taps through the rows of old moss-covered stone markers, for the first time in 10 years, Ren no longer felt the guilt that had followed her since the night spinning red and blue lights painted the ceiling in treme. She no longer felt that she owed her father an unfinished revenge. She only felt that he could finally rest, and that she could finally stop running on his behalf. Behind her, at a respectful distance, far enough not to intrude yet close enough that she could hear him breathe, stood Ronan Blackwood in a charcoal suit, his right hand holding Augie's small one, the boy dressed in his first formal white shirt and navy trousers, with all the seriousness of a child who knew the moment mattered. And when Ren turned after laying down the flowers, the three of them said nothing. Ronan only gave a single nod, and Augie extended his free hand so she could walk out of the cemetery with them. Teddy had completed a full 2 months of recovery at Willowbrook on the south shore of the lake. He had gained 14 pounds. The healthy bronze of youth had returned to his skin, and the curiosity in his eyes that Ren hadn't seen since before their father's death had finally come back. A month earlier, he had begun apprenticing in the woodworking shop of Harrison Boudreaux, Ronan's old friend who owned the largest cypress mill on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. Teddy came home each evening with wood splinters in his forearms and a small notebook full of joinery sketches and notes on mortise and tenon work, and Ren had come to understand that at last her brother had found something for his hands to do that didn't numb him into not feeling. Ren herself had completed her forensic accounting certificate through Tulane University in March, and at the beginning of April she had started part-time work at Fairfield Forensic Associates, a small financial investigation firm in the Central Business District that helped the families of victims trace assets stolen through layers of shell companies by criminal organizations. The work led her back to the handwriting in Donovan Blackwood's journal, but this time not as a grieving daughter, rather as a professional with her own business card that read W. Caldwell beneath the title Financial Forensics Analyst. She had rented a small studio apartment in Marigny, a clean third-floor place in a red brick building overlooking Washington Square Park, exactly 22 miles from the Blackwood estate, a distance she had chosen with care, near enough to reach dinner in 30 minutes, far enough that she could truly stand on her own 2 feet. On weekends they saw one another. Sometimes Ren drove her old moss-green Jeep Wrangler, newly bought from a neighbor, to the estate for dinner with Augie and Ronan. Sometimes they visited her in the little apartment where she cooked spaghetti. Ronan had taught her or brought home pizza from Pizza Domenica on Magazine Street, and nothing between them moved faster than the pace Ren allowed. On a warm Saturday afternoon in April, with the temperature at 79 degrees and the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, Ren drove her Jeep across the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge to the estate. On the passenger seat beside her sat a small square wooden box containing seeds she had ordered from an old nursery in Abita Springs that specialized in native Louisiana plants, and the moment she stopped before the front steps, Augie came running from the eastern garden barefoot, wearing a t-shirt with a brachiosaurus on it, both hands smeared with brown earth from the feelings garden he tended, and he rushed into her arms in the most natural way, without hesitation, without that careful thoughtfulness of the early days, simply hugging her because she had arrived. "You're here, Ren. I've been waiting since noon. Did you decide what tree you're planting?" Ren laughed, crouched down, opened the wooden box, and showed him. "I did, Augie. I figured it out. He lifted the lid carefully, and inside was a small paper packet full of native white magnolia seeds, and he paused and looked up at her with wide blue-gray eyes. Magnolia. But that's my mom's tree. Ren knelt to his height, placed a hand softly against his cheek, and answered in a quiet voice. That's exactly why, Augie. I want to plant a tree like your mom's, because I want to stay close to the people who loved her. I think that's the right tree for me. The boy stood silent for a long moment, his little brows drawing together the way they always did when he was sorting through an emotion he didn't yet have words for. Then he nodded with the same solemn seriousness he had worn the day he gave her the first obsidian stone in the kitchen 6 months earlier. Okay, I'll help you plant it. I know where the best soil is. At the gate to the eastern garden, Ronan appeared in a pale gray shirt with his sleeves rolled exactly 3 turns. That small, precise detail Ren had not seen repeated in many weeks, and now the sight of it made something inside her chest stir softly, and the small scar on his left side had faded to a white line beneath the fabric. He stood there looking at her through the sunlight filling the garden, not hurrying toward her, only looking, and Ren looked back, and between them stretched a silence full of things that no longer needed saying. The 3 of them planted the young magnolia together. Augie dug the neat round hole with his child's shovel. Ren lowered the sapling into place and kept it straight. Ronan filled the soil back in with his large hands, and afterward they watered it, using the elephant-nosed watering can Augie had insisted on buying from the toy shop the month before. Then they sat down on the stone bench beside it. Augie ran off to play with Jasper, the 6-month-old golden retriever Ronan had adopted from a rescue for Augie the month before, and Ren and Ronan remained sitting side by side. You said you didn't have the right to love anyone, Ren reminded him, her eyes on the newly planted magnolia. That was before I understood that silence can kill too, Ronan answered. So what do you understand now? I understand that my world isn't what it used to be. Now it has a garden in it, and a woman who knows how to choose the right tree to plant. He reached into his breast pocket, took out a thin silver ring, plain and unadorned, no engraving, no stone, only a simple band, and placed it in her palm. This isn't a proposal, Ren. It's a promise. That whenever you're ready, I'll be here. No hurry, no pressure. Ren accepted the ring and held it in her hand as delicately as a petal, but she didn't put it on. I need more time, Ronan, but I'm not going anywhere. He nodded, peaceful. 3 figures beneath the young magnolia in the April light. A man who once believed he no longer had the right to love. A woman who once believed she had nothing left to love, and a 7-year-old child who understood feelings better than either of them. And somewhere not far away, Augie was laughing as he called for Jasper, and Ren Caldwell was no longer the bartender hiding behind the counter of velvet ember to conceal the tragedy inside her. She was a woman who had learned that some men step out of darkness, not to swallow the light, but to protect it from being extinguished, and that some families aren't born from blood, but built from broken pieces that find one another at exactly the right moment. And there beside the young magnolia in the garden of a man who knew how to cook, and a child who knew how to listen to the heart, she found the one thing a lifetime of running had never given her, a place to stop, lay down her burdens, and simply remain. If the story of Ren and Ronan touched your heart, if you cried with Ren on that limestone step at dawn, if you smiled with Augie when he held out his peace stone in the bright early kitchen, then please don't forget to give us a like so the channel can keep bringing you even more meaningful stories. Please share this video with the people you love, with the sister carrying too much on her shoulders, with the friend who feels lost in life, because every one of us deserves to find a place to stop running, a garden where burdens can be set down, and a few people who choose to stay beside us. And if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the moving stories and healing journeys we'll continue to share in the videos ahead. We'd truly love to hear what you felt. Do you think Ren should have put on the silver ring that April afternoon? Or was she right to ask for more time so she could stand fully on her own first? What part of the story made you pause the longest? What made your heart beat in a different way? Please leave a comment below the video so we in the community can read what came from the deepest part of your heart, because every word you share is a small flame that makes this channel warmer and gives us more reason to continue. We wish everyone listening today good health, a peaceful life, loved ones beside you through every hard season, a home warm enough to rest in, a table full enough to share, and a heart calm enough to live each day fully. Thank you for spending your precious time with us all the way to the last line of this story. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.